Good morning, good afternoon, folks. Thanks for those that are joining us. We are going to give it a few minutes to make sure that we allow everyone that's jumping from meeting to meeting that they have enough time to get in here. So we appreciate your patience as we prepare to get started.
See, if we're not careful, we're gonna have to start telling jokes and doing setups here.
Oh yeah. I've got
My
a few dad
repertoire.
I've got a few dad jokes, but I want people to stick around. So I think I'm
I
gonna
was
keep
gonna
those
say,
to myself.
that's about where I live these days.
In my head, I was just basically starting to play elevator music.
Whatever gets you closer to the holidays, right?
Oh, please don't start with the Christmas music yet. I'm not on the holiday music and all that. Oh my goodness.
We should, yeah, we should have had that as a poll of, yeah.
What's the most annoying holiday song?
Yeah.
We have a rule in our house: no holiday music until after Thanksgiving. So
I usually am the most stringent person in the world on that rule. I am very strict about it. But this year I'm changing my tune because I'm gone for a lot of December. So it's like, I want to feel Christmas in my home. I celebrate Christmas. Everyone's entitled to obviously celebrate whatever they want. I celebrate Christmas. So I put up my tree and everything this past weekend.
oh, there you go.
I texted my mom. I'm like, sorry, I'm breaking family rules.
Yeah, that's our Friday post Thanksgiving. We don't do Black Friday. We go. Unfortunately, we murder a Christmas tree. We drag it home, and in Virginia, that's still a thing. I don't know if those in California, if you're allowed to murder.
Yeah, California, I put up my artificial tree this weekend. Okay. But in Minnesota, yeah, no, we'd go out to the whatever wilderness pickup truck, get some trees chopped down, and bring them back.
There you go. Kevin, do we break enough airtime for you?
I think we're good here. So yeah, we can go ahead and actually start on a good segue here. We have a poll that we're going to be tossing out to the folks that are joining here. So first things first, if you want to go ahead and answer your favorite Thanksgiving dish, we're going to kind of pepper in some very fun topics around unified assessments along with Thanksgiving. So we're going to kind of just ease into it here. So feel free to take a second to answer what's in front of you here.
I was trying to answer myself, but it looks like I'm not allowed to answer here. But I'll go ahead and fill in my answer for everyone. I'm a sucker for a good pumpkin pie, but I love making stuffing. We're hosting every 3 years we get to host, and we're hosting this year. And my wife and I get into an annual debate on the right way to make stuffing. And then there has to be that one person in the family that wants the oysters in the stuffing, which I do not subscribe to. So we have to pull out one little bit of the stuffing and bake it in the oven with oysters, which that's not a tradition in my family, but for my wife's family, when her folks are joining, we have to.
That must be an East Coast thing. I have never heard of that.
Yeah,
it is.
That's East Coast to me.
So it'd be interesting to if anyone else can fill in the blank of what is the oddest thing you put in your stuffing. Cranberries or cherries, and I've seen in stuffing, but
we put a bunch of dried fruit in ours.
What do you do, Ashley? What's your favorite dish?
The stuffing dressing is mine if it's my family recipe. If I'm at my in-laws, pumpkin pie. My sister-in-law is a phenomenal baker, so her pumpkin pie. But if my family, if I'm hosting or one of my sisters or something, stuffing dressing, we put spicy Jimmy Dean sausage in it. And then instead of water for the breadcrumbs, we use turkey drippings, and then every herb you've ever heard of, and then a bunch of dried fruit, put it in the oven, and then put a bunch of.
So are you stuffed the bird, or out of the bird?
It's separate. It's a totally separate dish. It is the main dish of our Thanksgiving table. The turkey is a side.
There you go. Awesome. Well, I think we can probably wrap up this poll, see if we've got anyone who voted on anything yet. I don't know if we had any participants there. There we go. We got some
Turkey.
turkey fans. There you go. Turkey's the big winner. Number of folks that keeping Purdue in business or other, poultry places. But pumpkin pie and potatoes look like they're rounding out for a tie on the back end of this. Fantastic. Well, thanks
And
for participating.
it looks like your stuffing's taking up the back there, Jeremiah.
Apparently
couldn't
Jeremiah
vote.
are the only
We
ones who
couldn't
voted
vote.
for that.
So we could have maybe moved the needle a little bit there, but we're representing the stuffing folks here. We'll have a couple of different polls in here. Kevin, why don't you go ahead and just get us started with some, introductions of what we're here to talk about, and we'll kind of jump into things.
Yeah, sure. So you guys, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm Kevin Cutter, been with the consultancy going on 7 years now. We're a boutique end-to-end information security consulting firm. So pretty much anything that would roll up from a professional service perspective to the Office of Information Security. Tevora is an organization that has 20 years experience supporting all sorts of folks in that capacity. So today's topic is to unify or not to unify. So when to streamline multiple compliance frameworks. A lot of our clients obviously have a lot in scope with different headaches. So today's session is really about figuring out ways to create efficiencies amongst your team and your ongoing initiatives around different compliance frameworks. I'm joined today by Ashli Pfeiffer. If you want to introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks, Kevin. So hi, everyone. My name is Ashli Pfeiffer, and I'm a managing director at Tevora over our compliance and consulting practices, including SOC 1 and SOC 2 compliance, ISO audit and support, and then our general information security or GRC support practices. My career has been in consulting from the get-go, spanning from financial operations to system implementation, which has allowed me to work across pretty much every industry in my near 15 years of consulting. The majority of the last 8 years have been dedicated to information security at Tevora, and have done a lot of work around these unified assessments and figuring out how we really partner with our clients, keeping that security in mind, but minimizing the work that goes with all of this compliance. And I'll kick it over to Jeremiah so you can introduce yourself as well.
Thanks, Ashli. I didn't join 8 years ago. I joined Tevora 7 years ago, about the same time that Kevin did. But throughout my career, I've been a CISO in an organization. I've worked as a consultancy in other firms, been a system administrator spanning back all the way to the mid-90s, really helping with organizations throughout this, evolution where compliance actually became a thing. HIPAA was probably one of the very first frameworks that was out there. I am a recovering PCI QSA. Once that's in your DNA, you're always trying to figure out how to get away from that. So I've got a lot of experience in the retail front. I am a HITRUST assessor as well. Worked with a number of frameworks, a lot of health organizations over my career, and so certainly have some thoughts and some where it makes sense, where these things mash together, and we'll hopefully share some of those stories during our conversation today. So,
and one thing to mention too as we get going, if you have any questions at all, as both Ashli and Jeremiah are going through the content, don't hesitate to include those. We'll do everything that we can to tackle those at the end as we wrap up.
So as we're getting into this, I think we have another poll question or two we can probably throw in there just to kind of give us some insights into the audience today, what they're dealing with. I think the first one here is around audit fatigue. So if anyone's got any insights, we'll keep this open for a couple minutes here, and then Kevin, why don't we kind of get the conversation going between me and Ashli and go from there.
Yeah, it sounds good.
So maybe I'll go ahead and kick things off. What is a unified audit? I know this is something that is the main topic of conversation. Some of the things that we'll talk about today, I think will span both, when does it make sense? What does it not make sense? But I'll start with the first part here is, what is a unified audit? Let's make sure we're talking the same language. And so I like to think back, probably about 15 years ago, I was working with an entity in the Gaming Commission. I was talking to him about all of the regulations and requirements, and when I was talking to him, he had 30 different audits that he had to go through on an annual basis. It was like, yeah, every week and a half, I'm starting a new audit, going through some compliance framework, whether or not it was the Nevada Gaming Commission, whether or not it was within the payment card industry, whether or not it was something else, some of the other frameworks that they have subscribed to. And so what is unified audit? And for us, it's taking an audit activity and trying to streamline that audit by coupling up. If I'm doing two different frameworks, maybe I can combine that effort. And in this day and age, staff is so short of time. There are shorter resources. Everyone's calendars are super full. So one of the ways to help combat that, and this question we have up here, is audit fatigue. So maybe we can go ahead and close out this policy if we've got any answers, yes or no. But a unified audit, the attempt here is to go ahead and find a way to help solve that by conducting multiple audit frameworks at once. Ashli, do you have any other color you want to add to that?
Thanks, Jeremiah. No, I mean, you covered it pretty well there. The only other thing that I would mention is, just for clarity, when we talk about these unified audits or unified assessments, in terms of what that really means for you, tactically speaking, it's about reducing your work, which, of course, sounds good. And what that entails is the two big buckets of that are the interviews, that time that you and your people spend talking to auditors and assessors like Jeremiah and myself. Those interviews, sharing those. So that, like in that gaming commission example, instead of kind of having the same conversation every 2 weeks with different auditors, try to condense that and really do it once, then your auditor uses it as needed across all the different frameworks. And then the other one, other than those interviews, that time talking, is about the artifacts or the evidence or the documents, whatever noun you like to use. Providing it once. And again, the audit team might use it multiple times for different reports, but it's about your team not having to pull your data classification policy 5 times for 5 different frameworks, even if it hasn't changed in the 4-month time that you get those 5 different requests. And that's tactically what we're talking about in terms of these unified assessments. Again, and it's to address that audit fatigue, which it looks like pretty much everyone answered yes, or other on that. But, it's something that we hear from almost everyone we work with. At whatever scale, even if it's just a few audits they're dealing with, but it's just one person. So handling multiple at a big company feels very intense. Or like that example Jeremiah was speaking to, of it's dozens, that audit fatigue really hits home with everyone. So we want to reduce that with teams.
Thank you, Ashli. Thank you, Jeremiah. Go ahead.
Add some more color there. One of the things that, it never ceases to amaze me how many different frameworks or audit activities an entity needs to go through. You're even talking about even a small financial services company that they sell, they're buying and selling stocks, or all of a sudden they're selling insurance to, even if they're a small little outfit, all of a sudden you're starting to get SEC requirements. Now, maybe the FTC's new safeguard rules are applying, or maybe even the insurance requirements that are out there, or gosh, if you're actually operating in the state of New York now, New York State DFS requirements are out there. It never seems to be a shortage of yet another framework for an organizations to go through. And it just makes sense to try to do your work once and use it as often as you can. But we'll talk about some examples of things that work and things that create struggles. But go ahead, back to you, Kevin.
Awesome. Thank you both. So yeah, in your experience, Jeremiah, you first, what are some of the keys to conducting a successful unified audit that you've seen out there?
I'm actually one of the things I've seen for organizations is if they've taken the opportunity to help create their own security program with a common set of controls. So if you've made that investment within an organization to, hey, I'm going to center along the, maybe it's the secure controls framework, the SCF that people talk about. And I'm going to go ahead and subscribe to that as a common control. And I'm going to feather in my PCI, I'm going to feather in my ISO, feather in there. So certainly when you've made that internal investment and you've got a common control deployment across the organization, that helps. But I think there's some other, key obvious things. I'll pass over to Ashli if you want to talk about some other areas that, you've seen as being very successful.
Yeah, so there's really, in terms of keys to that successful unified assessment, Two big pieces come to mind. The first one is timing. So, as I mentioned, for like what a unified assessment really means, it's sharing the work, which ultimately reduces it for you. But in order to do that, timing is key. So every framework has its own rules or specifications about timing. So for example, a SOC 2 Type 2, all the artifacts have to represent the defined reporting period. Other compliance frameworks just have kind of guidelines, like within the last few months. HITRUST has its freeze period. There's a lot of different calendar and timing aspects by framework that have to be considered. And if you're thinking, oh no, that sounds complicated, don't worry, that's what we're here for. So with that timing, in addition to just timing of your assessments being key, it also means considering ahead of time. So really plan ahead of time with your audit teams or internally with your compliance teams so that you understand what that effort will be. You also might need to shift some of your compliance dates. Almost always, if we're moving to a unified assessment, you're going to have to change some of your compliance dates, which is perfectly fine. It doesn't cause any problems inherently, but you want to make sure you have time to consider that, check any other type of impacts, and really make it work for your teams. Also make sure that, one compliance person doesn't say, yes, we can shift that date, but then another product team can't support that new time because they had a launch that month. So I really planning ahead of time to get those pieces aligned. The other one, in terms of that key to success, is to think about scope. So it seems fairly self-explanatory, but it is crucial enough to warrant me mentioning it, of what the actual framework is assessing or what each certification is covering needs to match or really heavily overlap. So for example, if your company, you have multiple product offerings or service offerings, they of course will have their own, development pipeline, or maybe their own other security tools used for each of those different product offerings. But in order to achieve that unified assessment, they should have a lot of shared services, essentially, back-end support. So that can be things like HR. It could be maybe there's one incident response team that's covering both of them, company-wide policies, which would apply to both of them, things like that. That will enable you to truly capture the benefits we've talked about for unified assessment, of supplying those company-wide policies once and being used for both of those products that are being covered, or interviewing that incident response team once and being used. So again, working early, either internally with your teams or with a partner like Tevora, to identify where those overlaps are between your different areas of compliance, and assisting how and where, to make those match, will ultimately help you and your company get, really the most bang for your buck in terms of those compliance efforts.
When thinking about, timing, I think that's, you touched on it and you talked about it, but can we maybe add some color on how far out should you plan? Like if I'm going to tackle a new framework, what kind of roadmap, a new executive says, hey, we need to enter the space. And I've got a vision I can share with on the FedRAMP side. Hey, we want to add FedRAMP. We want to be a FedRAMP certified entity. Maybe you can, if you're adding, let's say SOC to something hasn't had SOC before, how far out do you want to plan for that compliance date versus the preparation? Because I think there's, when do you feather this into your existing overall compliance program?
So I generally tell people, if you want to add a compliance framework and or just unified existing ones, I say start planning a year in advance. And that's the start planning, because you're going to it's going to be kind of slow roll discussions in the beginning, but you want to make sure you get those conversations started so that you can, on, the good side, get the answer of, yep, it'll be easy. We'll just, have a formal kickoff, deep dive scope discussion 6 months down the road, and it should be good. Or the other side of, no, this is a major change. There are major considerations. Let's get a interim health check or a gap assessment if it's adding new frameworks or big changes. Or, hey, thinking about that timing again. So for example, SOC 2 has a reporting period, or Type 2s have a reporting period. Maybe it's, let's cut it short by 9 months so that it can better align with your existing ISO audit, because that has an external auditor component and those schedules are harder to manipulate than just your own SOC 2 Type 2 reporting period. So we might give that advisement. But again, because it might be cutting it short 1 year to then align it fully in future years, about a year in advance is when you want to start those conversations, so you have time for any needed prep work, any assessments, or any shifts in your actual assessment timing.
Great. I definitely agree with that. I'll tell two ends of a spectrum here. We did have one client come to us and say, hey, we need to be FSMA compliant at the moderate 853. How fast can we do it? And we're like, probably like fast as 9 months. they were actually able to help them get compliant in 180 days, which was 6 months, which is lightning fast. And that took executive sponsorship. There's actually a webinar or recording from RSA. It was a talk there on how to get to that endpoint. But really, I don't think you can do many frameworks in 6 months out of the gate. It's really, that 9 to 12 benchmark. I know we work with a lot of folks in the DoD supply chain space with this upcoming, hopefully upcoming CMMC requirements. There's a lot of chatter going on in that world. But getting certified through that process, 6 months is a realistic timeline. If you're doing something that's more complicated, like a FedRAMP, that's 12 to 18 months because and I think it really just depends on the nature and the complexity, the specificity of the particular compliance framework. So I'd say if you're planning for, doing a unified audit approach, you have to plan, to your point there, Ashley, and that planning time may vary quite a bit depending upon complexity.
Yeah. And on that, actually, I think we have another poll question to get some better understanding of what type of compliance frameworks this group is working with. Let's kick off those final 2 poll questions about the number and which frameworks.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, because as you guys can hear, like Jeremiah and I are able to give some real life examples, talk about our experience and stuff, but we want to be able to cater it a little bit to what this group is really dealing with and, what type of pieces are in there.
I think, when you get, you start with unifying an audit with at least 2 frameworks, right? Otherwise it's not unified. Yeah. But then you get to, working with clients with 3, 4, 5, that definitely has a level of complexity that can also come with it. While it's satisfying, maybe that evidentiary collection once, which maybe we'll talk about here in a few minutes. So let's see who's clicking on what, and let's flip over. Let's get a result here and click into the next one just so we can have some details. 2 to 4 seems to be the sweet spot with.
And then, with a little bit over 10. So there's definitely some room, some efficiencies to grab, some hours to save yourselves. Let's kick off that next one. There we go. So everyone just check any of these that apply to you. We know there are others than this. There are infinite number of acronyms, it seems, for all the compliance frameworks. But these are the core ones. So just check any that apply to you.
Fantastic. And bingo cards to whoever gets all of those frameworks all at once.
Yeah, that over 10 answer might be able to
you get the free t-shirt and bingo card. All right, let's go ahead and get the answer and see where we got, just to hone the next couple of questions and discussions that come out of today's conversation. There we go.
Okay, so a lot of SOC, pretty much everyone has the ISO and PCI and a couple of SOC 2.
There you go. Okay, thanks.
And that tracks with what we see in our industry of the most common ones. HIPAA and HITRUST, of course, very common and needed, but have a much more specific sector within healthcare, although that data is starting to come across to a little few more companies than you'd expect these days. But the ISO, SOC 2, PCI are definitely the heavy hitters in terms of number of companies that need to do them. There's also something Jeremiah was speaking earlier about, even small companies having a lot of regulatory requirements in terms of what compliance needs they have. One of the other pieces is for B2B businesses, it's also just about your partners or your customer and their contracts will require them, which is why we'll see higher numbers of SOC 2, ISO, and PCI, because those are simply more commonly used, and the popularity builds popularity essentially for those companies. When they're building contracts, will list those. And so then if you're engaging in a new business agreement, it might list one of those and you have to grab it. One thing on that, the reason I mention it is when you are in those B2B needs for compliance, for those certifications, it's a really good idea to work either internally or with someone like Tevora to understand the details of it. Very often we see companies who have been required via a new contract to be PCI compliant or to be SOC 2 compliant, and it's clearly just a line item from a lawyer and it really doesn't apply to them. So for PCI, you can really descope that to a really simple SAQ with a lot of NAs, take away a lot of the anxiety of having to go through a full level 1 ROC, because that might not truly apply to you. There can also be a discussion of perhaps if it doesn't really apply to you, maybe there's some language in there of it is some type of framework. And then there's something else that you're already doing that you can capture for that need. So again, it's really just considering that for the sake, focusing on that security and then making sure that the compliance frameworks that you're doing makes sense for your business as much as possible, without just doing it in a check the box style.
And I think actually with that in mind, it's a great segue to the next point. So as a trusted partner, which Tevora is to many of its clients, when does it not make sense to conduct a unified assessment, Ashley? When would you be advising, hey, this is probably something you guys shouldn't have to do?
Yeah, I'll start with that one because it echoes with some of the things I was saying about the keys to success, but then I'll kick it over to Jeremiah as well, as I know he'll have some good examples. So when to avoid it, one thing is if you're really not achieving those keys to success I mentioned about align, timing, and scope. So a really common example is that a company engages us to do a unified assessment and they want to just kind of hit the ground going right away. So we go in there, we try to do this, and they're expecting to have minimal evidence requests, faster timelines, things like that. But then what we discover, if there wasn't the planning sessions done, if it had to be rushed for that client need, is that the timing doesn't align. So there is not shared evidence, and we would have to require, and you would have to provide a whole new sample set, which is essentially what you were doing before when they were separate, and therefore reduces, of course, that benefit of the unified assessment. So that leads to headaches, roadblocks, things like that, and really doesn't achieve that goal in that first year. The other item that comes to mind, a pitfall to avoid, is around key changes. So this is both for your company and the framework. So what I mean by that, key changes for your company, this isn't things like feature enhancements or just your standard change process, of course. This is things like M&A activities, mergers, acquisitions. So you're doing an overhaul of your entire structure, maybe new policy sets, or a major infrastructure change, migrating from one provider to another. These things happen. Of course, they're a part of business. They will happen. But in that time is not a good time to start a unified assessment process. And this is because the changes itself add a layer of complexity. So some frameworks require that you actually test the old and the new. So you already have that extra effort. And your teams are already truly just having to handle a lot of changes. Change in business, change in process requires extra work by everybody. We all know this. And so then trying to do something new, the planning and some of the prep work required for that unified assessment, it is going to feel more complicated than helpful at that time. So it's best to wait. And then the other side of
jump in on that,
Oh, yeah,
the merger and acquisition there, because I just had an example just 2 days ago. I was on a sales call, and this large conglomerate, they have a number of larger entities underneath them, and they're going through an M&A process. And these are both within the DoD space, so they both have CMMC requirements. And they were saying, hey, we're doing an assessment of this environment. Does it make sense to loop in this other entity that they're getting ready to close? They know it's going to close, and it's like, no, absolutely not. You don't know when they're going to come in here. They could have a completely different maturity level, better, or in some cases much worse. And so it's like, no, that M&A is definitely a reason that, hey, let's keep these two environments probably separate and only audit and assess one at a time, because they're different environments, different maturities, and if you're doing M&A, different surprises. And so you don't want to tarnish what you've built that is good with something that you bring in that may not be so good. Anyway, absolutely. I did want to cut you off there on, talking about some of the other changes in the frameworks, but
no, not at all. It was a great example, and that hits it perfectly. It is really all about the surprises that will happen in that scenario. And then on the flip side of that, the other changes that I was mentioning is framework changes. So in a year when the framework itself is going through a considerable change, it can lead to similar complications and surprises. So for example, contextually this year, PCI 4.0 was effective in spring of this year, with another phase of controls being applicable March of 2025. But in this year, the scope of PCI, in terms of the scope of it actually looks at for your CDE, as well as the requirements within, have increased the effort for both auditors and companies as they get ready for that. And so because of that, we had some clients who really wanted to do a unified assessment for the first time this year. And as we worked with them and really uncovered that the remediations that they had worked on from gap assessments to get ready for 4.0 had taken longer than they wanted, they were still really trying to finalize a lot of those pieces. Coming at it with unified would not work, again, because that timing wouldn't align, because the remediation for new compliance requirements adds another element. And then getting all of those pieces to align didn't work. So we ended up keeping a couple separate to ultimately end in success of achieving their PCI cert on time, what they need for their banks, of course, and then getting their other assessments such as SOC 2 in a normal cadence. Now, frameworks are going to update every couple of years. We know this. Not each change is significant enough to kind of hit this mark that I'm saying don't add that unified assessment right now. You can work with your internal experts or ask Tevora, anytime. That's a pretty simple question about when the change is significant enough to really hesitate about making changes in your compliance plans. Jeremiah, either building on that, or were there other areas that you wanted to touch on of things to consider to, when unified assessment, it really doesn't make sense?
Absolutely. So there's two things I want to talk about. First one, it may seem like a good idea on the surface, but when you actually peel back the onion, it may not make sense. So I'm going to talk about two frameworks here. I'm going to talk about FedRAMP, which is based upon NIST 853, and CMMC, which is based on NIST 800-171. 800-171 has 110 controls, has 14 control families. It's largely, on the surface, it looks like a subset of FedRAMP and NIST 853. And from a control perspective, it absolutely is. But we see these large organizations that maybe have multiple business services and functions, and they're defense contractors, and they offer things out there, and they're trying to, solicit capabilities to federal agencies. But fundamentally, FedRAMP is about creating a software as a service, platform as a service, or cloud solution offering that you're putting out there on the internet, something that you're making available to an organization so that they can consume it and inherit all your security controls. Whereas CMMC, which is based on NIST 800-171, is about DoD subcontracting and confidentiality. You want enclaves. You don't want anyone to have access to this information. So that's stuff that you keep behind firewalls on-prem, somewhere that is not publicly accessible. And so there's two drastic scope differences there, where they may still be controlled by the same security team and a shared sense of responsibilities. Their scope deployment and footprints are vastly different. One's a cloud service you're trying to expose to the world. One's confidential DoD secrets that we're trying to protect anyone from accessing. So the scope is just very different. And then the second one really comes down to the level of evidence that's required for these different frameworks. If you're talking about something that's super light, one of my favorite frameworks I like to reference is the New York State DFS 500. It's for financial, insurance, banking entities that operate in the state of New York. It's 15 controls. It's maybe 10 pages long. It's the easiest framework for a new person. So I love having our interns or CDPers kind of go through it just to kind of understand basic concepts. You understand everything in here. There's not a whole lot of evidentiary collection on that. So it's kind of nice because if you're having and pairing that with another framework that has a lot of evidentiary collection, then you know that you'll be able to upscale it. But just kind of understanding and being prepared that just because you've been doing something that maybe has a lighter evidence and sampling requirement, if you're adding on or upscaling into something that has a bigger evidentiary requirement, bigger sampling, that's going to be an additional effort for an organization. So just kind of being prepared that say, oh, we're just going to add it on and do the same thing we did before. Nah. There may be some additional sampling work that and evidentiary collection that is required for an organization. So that's definitely something that I would think about.
Well, perfect. The next point here, in your opinion, do GRC platforms help?
Well, we have one. Let's start with that. We have our own portal. We've built our portal around being able to do various compliance assessments, these unified audit activities to help facilitate, not only the data collection and interviewing process for our customers. Like Ashli had kind of started, there's, evidentiary requests, that request lists that are key to all these frameworks. What are the upfront documents we need to see? And so, yeah, they can absolutely help. What's important, though, is that you've got a partner that actually understands not only the framework, but your business and how your business applies to these frameworks. So I think that's where, there's tools out there, but the magic is those that can understand, interpret, and apply those controls into your business environment. So I think the conversation needs to be bigger than just, any old GRC platform. It's there's tools that are out there that help facilitate it, but you need the folks that can actually interpret, understand, and help guide someone through that process. Do you have anything to add on, when you're going through the evidentiary collection or any of that stuff there, Ashley?
Yeah, I think you captured it well. The phrase that I always use in this question is "devil's in the details" when it comes to those, which we'll call that just kind of the bow tied on Jeremiah's answer there.
All
That's
right.
perfect. And then we actually did have a few questions from the audience. So
Perfect.
either of you, by all means, feel free to tackle this. So the first one, are any frameworks recommended to Unify essentially the easiest? Like what pairs really well together? I guess back to our Thanksgiving strategy, but what would be the path of least
Yeah.
resistance?
Pair together, like you said, pairing wine. Yeah, pair turkey
Yeah.
to.
A
I think
fine-
you need
a
white
fine wine
wine
pairing.
with turkey. Is that right?
All wine goes with Thanksgiving meals. that's my opinion.
I'm typically a red guy. No, so pairing. Yeah. Which ones do you see the most there, Ashley? I'll
Yeah.
share my thoughts. But
Yeah, I'll kick off there. There's a lot here. And again, this is going to come back to some of the details matter about what your exact scope is, because different frameworks have different rules of exactly how you define the scope. But generally speaking, what's going to apply to most, one of the biggest ones is actually SOC 2 and HIPAA, specifically the HIPAA security rule. There's about a 98% overlap in terms of what the requirements are, but and therefore the evidence and topics that are going to be needed. So it is fair, if you need both of those, it is fairly simple lift and shift to achieve that. The next one that I'd say is pretty common, we get asked a lot, it would be PCI and SOC 2. What we do say at Tevora is that really it's only the PCI level 1 that is going to really overlap well with SOC 2, the smaller scopes of PCI, SAQs, etc. You could do your unified, absolutely. You're not going to achieve a lot of efficiencies because the SAQs have a much more limited scope and are looking at a different piece there. I will also caveat that, like I was mentioning, that in years when frameworks have major shifts, it's hard to do unified. So this year with the new 4.0 requirements, we have worked with clients in different paths. Sometimes unified makes sense, sometimes it doesn't, based on how they prepped for 4.0. But in the next couple of years, as that balances out again, those do generally pair pretty well together. There's a couple other ones, Jeremiah, I'll kick them over to you around like which ones that HITRUST and FedRAMP and CMMC come with. Or do well with, I should say.
Well, as a recovering HITRUST person as well, I will. HITRUST is a unique beast in itself. However, one of the things that so HITRUST has their own. HITRUST is different. For those that don't know, is there's a scoping exercise that happens when you do a HITRUST assessment, and you pick how big of an organization, how many employees, and the type of information, and you put all those scoping factors together, and it's the one, not the one framework, but a framework that is very dynamic in how many controls. We've got clients that go from anywhere from 250 controls all the way up to one of our clients has 900 HITRUST controls that they have to audit against. And so, but one of the things that you can do inside of HITRUST is add your external frameworks. You can add PCI, you can add CMMC, you can add all sorts of things to it. And so if you're going down the HITRUST path, you can naturally pair that with any of the other frameworks that are in their MyCSF subscription. So, you can pair them naturally. Now, that will create for a longer assessment. And I will warn folks, though, against, just because you've added PCI to your HITRUST doesn't make you PCI compliant. It doesn't give you the ROC artifacts. It helps you with your controls analysis and the assessment process that we go through. So I'd say almost a lot of things can be paired with HITRUST, but folks tend to try to, again, keep the scope minimum. You don't want to assess your whole organization against all your controls all the time. If you've got limited money, limited resources, limited time, then you want to sometimes keep those more narrowly focused. So you heard me talk about FedRAMP and CMMC, the NIST 800-171, NIST 853, NIST 853 frameworks do pair well together if the scope matches. So they pair with an asterisk. So sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it does not. That's a couple of insights for me.
Perfect. So then, the next and final question, unless there's anything else that trickles in, you mentioned times to avoid doing a unified assessment. What if a major change or framework update is occurring, but a company's already been doing unified assessment for years? Should that organization break and do a separate for a year, or continue with unified audit despite possible issues?
Yeah, great question. So in the items to avoid, the big changes where I said avoid doing the unified assessments, that was really about doing new or expanding. So whether this is your first ever unified assessment, or if you were doing it for 2 frameworks and you wanted to expand to a 3rd in a year that those big changes were happening. So to this question, I would say that if your unified audit, unified assessment plan is already in place, you've been doing it for a couple of years, and there's one of these major changes, you can likely continue with your unified assessment with a couple of caveats. First one being, again, coming back to that plan to see if you do need any type of changes in your controls for, new framework requirements, or you need to align controls, like in an acquisition example where the acquired company has fewer controls, we'll say. So you want to make sure you get ahead of that. And then again, with that plan, when there's a framework change, you likely would need to do an interim gap or a health assessment to do that. Excuse me. And with that, it's work, even just have a conversation early. So for example, PCI, the changes that are going into effect March of 2025, reach out to us if you'd like, have a conversation about what those are to see if it makes sense to continue with your existing unified audit. But generally speaking, if you already have that process in place, you can continue with it. And then once everything has settled down, you could continue to grow it in future years.
I do, yeah, echo everything that Ashli just said. Plan. I'm gonna do we have any more questions? Because I have a wrap-up concept. Kevin, how we're
Nothing
doing?
else from a question perspective, it looks like. So Jeremiah, go right ahead.
One of the things when we think about compliance, compliance and security. So one of the things that, hey, well, I'm compliant with this, I'm compliant with that, breaches will happen. I see, and I think it's very important for folks to understand, compliance is the minimum established threshold for a particular audience to get everyone up to at least a benchmark. Being secure will oftentimes to go above and beyond, again, whatever your risk tolerance is, your risk threshold for the organization, and making these investments. But compliance doesn't equal security. I would say it helps enable to a point of security. And so, don't pin your whole program of your cybersecurity program only on compliance. Obviously, you have to meet whatever the regulatory requirements you have. But you also have to stay abreast of the emerging threats that are going on. What are the risks to your organization that may be outside of compliance? So we can't lose sight of the bigger picture as well. So just want to kind of share my thoughts. Any comment on that, Ashli, or anything else you want to add in here as some closing comments?
Thanks, Jeremiah. No, I think that captures it really well. And yeah, I'm really just echoing overall that, pretty much everyone on here mentioned that they're going through multiple frameworks. So if you have not yet thought about it, doing it in a unified approach, definitely recommend it. It is something that really across the board, if you consider the items that we talked about today, plan it with time, consider those impacts and alignment areas, it really can improve, which gives you time back to focus on security, as Jeremiah just mentioned, which is the true need here.
Thanks everyone for your time. Everyone have a happy Thanksgiving and safe travels for anyone on the road. Thanks
Happy
all.
holidays, everyone.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.